Good morning. Will you please join me in lighting the chalice? The words are in your order of service. We light this beacon of hope, sign of our quest for truth and meaning, in celebration of the life we share together.
When the weight of the world tips us over, when the winds of the world leave us spinning, when the voices of the world lead us astray, may we remember that here, home is always waiting. with stillness to calm us, friends to anchor us, and voices to help us find our way. The words of Reverend Scott Taylor call us into this place today. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
My name is Charlie Tyler. I'm the pastoral minister here at the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of the Low Country. Those of you that are longtime members, you know that you are here because you have found one of the kindest, most compassionate groups of people that exist on the planet. Those of you who are guests don't know that yet, but yes, we are. And I hope that you find yourself welcome here and find a place here that this may well be home for you in this spot. I'd like to take a moment to invite those of you who are first or second time visitors, if you would be willing to stand and introduce yourself briefly. Tell us where you're from, because more than likely somebody else in the room is from there too. So those of you that are on my right half of the sanctuary, your left, if there's some first time guests or visitors, would there anyone be willing to stand and introduce themselves? Yes, ma'am, if you would please.
Well, we're actually second time visitors. And I'm Janice James, and this is my husband Chuck, and we're from Saratoga Springs, New York.
Yeah, welcome back. Welcome back to both of you. On my left, your right, first or second time visitors, if you would please. Yes, all the way in the back first. A couple back there.
We were late because I went the wrong way on the street. I'm used to going south, this is Savannah, not north. I'm Jan Dine, this is my husband John Law. We are second time visitors, and we think we've found a home.
Thank you. We think you have too. Others on this side. I know there were some others. Yes, ma'am, if you would please.
I'm Betty, this is Dan Abbas, and we're from Rochester, New York. We're here for 3 months.
Are there others? Yes, I'm going to call Linda out real quick.
I'm Linda Christopherson. I'm married to him. And this is my first time here, although I've watched your services online.
Thank you. And seated beside her is my sister.
I was going to say I'm Ray's cousin.
That's right.
Not Ray. I'm Charlie's.
Now you see what I have been overcoming for the last 70-something years. So welcome all of you who are guests and visitors. I pray that this is a meaningful time for you. We have a number of announcements that we need to move through. Paul, I know that you have something that you wish to share, so I'm going to ask you if you would, please. I know.
What's the attitude?
You can keep it short, Paul.
Keep it short. About 8:30 yesterday morning, Saturday morning, an army of Bee Gees descended upon this place. What ensued was a stupendous amount of raking, shoveling, blowing, carrying leaves, tremendous amount. And what, excuse me, this has resulted in, I hope you saw as you arrived today, a beautifully manicured property that we worked very hard on, and we think we had the results that we were looking for. So I want to recognize those BGs and honorary BGs that took place and took part in this, those that are here, those that are listening to us and streaming, and also want to recognize that Jim Lampke was here in his go-kart and he had a blower and blew around some leaves. And so what I'd like is all those that are here that participated, please stand. We'd like to recognize you. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you for your creative wisdom in getting this organized in the way that you did. Kathy Zeiser, I think you have an announcement that you would like to make.
Thank you.
Good morning, everybody.
everybody. I'm Kathy Zeiser, Chair of the Social Justice Committee of the UCL here. As you're all probably aware, South Carolina is one of only two states, is one of only two states in the United States without a hate crimes law. If, as an individual, you support passage of this bill, there are two following things that you can do to have your voice heard. Number one is attending AME Day at the Capitol, and that's members of the AME Church here in Bluffton, South Carolina, along with their family members and neighbors, will be gathering at the state capitol on Wednesday, this Wednesday, January 25th at 1:30 p.m. for a rally supporting the Hate Crimes Act. All are welcome to attend. The second one, for those who cannot attend the rally in Columbia and you want to show your support for this bill, you can go to the following website, and I have some papers with the website on it, so you don't have to copy this down, and sign a petition supporting passage of the Clementa C. Pinckney Hate Crimes Act. And it's www.change.org/pass the hate crimes bill in South Carolina. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. And if you guys need to get more information, seek her out after the service, and she'll be happy to repeat some of that information for you. Let's see. Clay, did you want to say anything? Yes or no? No? Okay. An announcement that Joanne has asked is that she let us know, I let you know, that her mother's funeral, Miss Joyce Maranziano, will be held here on February the 4th. Is that right? At 11:30. So just kind of be putting that down in your schedule to be a part of that celebration of life for Miss Joyce. The next 8th principal conversation. Ann Harrison has asked me to make this announcement. There is an insert in your order of service today that tells you about a couple of upcoming events. One of those events is the next gathering in the series of conversations. We're having about amending our 7th principles and adding an 8th principle, which specifically deals with anti-racism. We need to make just a slight correction. The next discussion will be held on Wednesday, February 8th, but the time and location have changed. The meeting will now take place at the home at Clay and Winnett Barnard. Would you guys raise your hands over there? That's where it's going to be. Go find them. They live on the island in Sea Pines. And it will begin at 11, it will begin at 10 instead of 11. Coffee and treats will be served. Sign up in the foyer if you'd like to attend. I think I did that right, Ian. Is that good? Okay. Are there any other announcements that we need to make before we move forward with the rest of our service? This is one of those Sundays. Yes, ma'am, if you would, Laura.
In the bulletin, it talks about Chris Matthews played Saturday, but it doesn't have the right date for Matt. He played last night. He should be, but then it has Matt's picture.
Yeah,
For the next concert.
It's a Friday night. So Joanne, when's the next concert? June 10th. February 10th. Which is a Friday. Yeah. So a little correction.
It just needs to be, I just want everybody to know it's February 10th.
Yes, okay. Thank you, Laura. Other announcements. So let me introduce to you Ray Tyler. He will be our keynote speaker here. He's been here one other time before, of course, and his command of history is captivating to many of us. Ray is a retired U.S. history teacher, now working part-time for Teaching American History, a nonprofit organization supporting American history and government teachers with access to original source documents and professional development programs. In 2014, Ray was awarded the James Madison Fellowship for South Carolina for his commitment to teaching the Constitution to his students. In his retirement, Ray contributes to the Teaching American History organization, We the Teachers blog, and ongoing document curation efforts. For over 30 years, Ray and his wife Linda Christofferson have been members and friends of the Piedmont Unitarian Universalist Church in Charlotte. Ray is also my first cousin What got left out is that I have taught him everything that he knows. Just to be clear. So Ray, thank you, if you would please.
Thanks, Charlie. I didn't know it was going to be so formal announcement of biography there, but my opening words today have become one of my favorite quotes. They're from The Souls of Black Folk, a book by W.E.B. Du Bois, who was one of the founders of the NAACP in the early 20th century and became quite a prominent sociologist, scholar, and leader of African American community and the nation in the early 20th century. I sit with Shakespeare and he winces not. Across the color line I move arm in arm with Balzac and Dumas, where smiling men and welcoming women glide in gilded halls. From out of the caves of evening that swing between the strong-limbed earth and the tracery of stars, I summon Aristotle and Aurelius, and what soul I will, and they all come graciously, with no scorn nor condescension. So wed with truth, I dwell above the veil. Is this the life you grudge us, O knightly America? Is this the life you long to change into dull red hideousness of Georgia? Are you so afraid lest peering from this high Pisgah between Philistine and Amalekite, we sight the promised land?
Thank you, Ray. If you would please take your hymnals into your hands now. Turn with me, if you will, to hymn number 361, Enter, Rejoice, and Commend. Stand if you're willing and able.
This is the time in our service when we share our joys and concerns with one another. For by sharing the joys, we find that they are enhanced, and by sharing the concerns, we find they are easier to bear. We will not stream this part of the service for your confidentiality. What we invite you to do is to come forward, take a stone from the table. Oh, they're not on the table. I will place stones on the table, and you will take a stone from the table. Share your joy or concern, and then place the stone in the cairn. We ask that you provide no advertisements and no political statements, please. Thank you all for sharing. And we have one more.
I'll come down to the mic. Good morning. This is real quick, and I don't normally get up here, but I wanted to share a joy. Yin yang. My youngest sister, Colleen, had heart valve replacement surgery on Wednesday, and it was a smashing success. I mean, it's amazing what modern medical science, and what I want to add is the procedure took 45 minutes. 45 minutes to replace a heart valve. Wow.
I will place 2 stones in the cairn for those joys and concerns that remain in your heart. And now, if you'll join me in our affirmation. In respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part, to accept and encourage one another in our free pursuit of truth, meaning, and spiritual growth, we gather in peace and love, to affirm the inherent worth and dignity of all people and all life, to promote justice, equity, and compassion in all aspects of life and living, to respect the right of conscience, and to support the use of democratic process in pursuit of peace, liberty, and justice for all. This we covenant with each other. And now, Dan Harrison.
So everyone knows that Frederick Douglass was born a slave. He came into this world on the eastern shore of Maryland in a little log hut in the year 1818. And he was a slave because his mother, Harriet, was a slave. She was owned by a white man they called Captain Anthony, who might have been Frederick's father. Frederick never really knew for sure. And although he knew who his mother was, he never really got to know her, because he was actually about, I guess he only saw her about 4 or 5 times in his life. And then when he was about 7, he heard she died. Frederick lived with his mother's parents until he was about 5 or 6, at which point he was considered old enough to work. So his grandmother took him to the plantation where Captain Anthony lived and dropped him off. Frederick was too young to work in the fields, so his job was to run errands for Captain Anthony's daughter, Lucretia, and her husband, Thomas, Mr. Thomas Auld, and that is spelled A-U-L-D. And for the next 2 years, Frederick lived on this plantation, and then one day when he was somewhere about the ages of 7 or 8, he was sent to Baltimore to live with Thomas's brother, Mr. Hugh Auld, and his wife, Sophia. Frederick was really happy to be in Baltimore, and he hoped that he would never see a plantation again. His job there was not only to run errands for Mr. and Mrs. Auld, but also to look after their son, Tommy, who at that time was 2. Tommy was 2, Frederick was 8. Frederick immediately bonded with Tommy, and for the first time in his life, he got to sleep in a bed with covers. He had good food to eat and clean clothes to wear, and this is where he discovered that there was such a thing as books. It was actually a special time in the life of Frederick Douglass. Sophia Auld, who was the lady of the house, had never owned a slave. So in the beginning, she was very compassionate towards Frederick, and she treated him like a son. Later in his life, he wrote, "The frequent hearing of my mistress reading the Bible, for she often read aloud when her husband was absent, soon awakened my curiosity in respect to this mystery of reading, and roused in me the desire to learn. Having no fear of my kind mistress before my eyes, I frankly asked her to teach me how to read, and without hesitation the dear woman began the task, and very soon, by her assistance, I was master of the alphabet, and I could spell words of 3 or 4 letters." Frederick was making good progress and things were going along just fine until Sophia Auld mentioned to her husband that she was teaching Frederick how to read. Mr. Auld immediately told his wife she could not continue these lessons. He told her what she was doing was not only against the law, but it was also unsafe. So being an obedient wife, Mrs. Auld ended the lessons. If you teach a slave to read, Mr. Auld told his wife, there will be no keeping him. He will become unmanageable and of no value to his master. An education will only make an enslaved person want to escape. Those words sank deep into Frederick Douglass's heart, and he had a revelation. The way Mr. Auld wanted to do everything he could to keep him from learning made Frederick see that it must be very important to know how to read. This was an incredible insight for Frederick Douglass. He now understood the white man's power to the enslaved black man. From that moment on, Frederick Douglass knew that literacy was the pathway from slavery to freedom. And he knew it was going to be difficult to learn without Mrs. Auld, but he decided he would do whatever it was going to take because he believed that once he learned how to read, he would be forever free. And from then on, whenever Frederick ran an errand, he always carried a notebook and pieces of fresh bread. And he would do his errands really quickly, and then he would find a hungry white boy in the streets, and he would trade the bread for a lesson. And after many, many long hours of hard work, Frederick Douglass essentially taught himself how to read. He was too young to actually plan his escape at that point, but he was thinking about it, and he knew that in order to get free, he was going to not only need to know how to read, but he was also going to need to know how to write. Now, Tommy, the little boy that he was taking care of, had gone off to school, and he'd already learned how to write. So Frederick would sit with Tommy's old spelling books and copy the letters over and over. And when he got pretty good at it, he would go down to the shipyard and pick up pieces of chalk that the workers had thrown away. And he'd go and he would write on fences and on the pavement and on brick walls. And it took him years and years, but after a long, tedious effort, he finally succeeded in also teaching himself how to write. There's so much that can be said about Frederick Douglass. In fact, when Ray Tyler, our speaker this morning, and I were talking this week, we both wished that we could take a few months to really explore what we could learn from his life. But at least we have Ray here this morning, and which means that we are all going to get at least one good history lesson. What I've shared is just a very tiny little piece of his overall story about how he learned to read and write. But it was his becoming literate during the 7 years that he lived in Baltimore that laid the foundation and opened the gateway for Frederick Douglass to become probably the most influential African American of the 19th century and one of the greatest abolitionists and icons of the struggle for racial justice in our country. It was Frederick Douglass's life of courage and determination that paved the way for the historic moment that some of you may have witnessed this past week. Just this past Wednesday, at the state capitol in Annapolis, the elected Democrat Wes Moore was sworn in as the governor of Maryland, right? And he became the state's first black governor and only the third African American in this country to hold the office of governor. And as he was being sworn in, Wes Moore got to place his hand on a Bible that was owned by Frederick Douglass. And he shared these words. He said, "As your governor, I will work every day to carry on Frederick Douglass's legacy of fighting for justice and equality. For I am not just an admirer of his, I am someone who is a true connoisseur of his life, of his teachings, of his writings. And I've wondered," he said, "what he would think about this moment, particularly with his life, with his sacrifice, with his frustrations. Well, I wondered that too. And then I decided, I'm pretty sure Frederick Douglass would have been proud. Yeah, and now I turn it over to Irene.
Thank you, Ann. That was wonderful. Am I on? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Okay. The part of the service is sharing from abundance. Okay, and this makes it look like it's obvious that we all have abundance, or this wouldn't be in the program. But it's not so evident. It's not so evident. Okay. We look like we have an abundance. Okay, we really do, and I hope you all do. I hope we all do. As a matter of fact. Okay, so and going back to Frederick Douglass, how he took his piece of bread and he traded it for something to learn how to read or write. I'm asking you too, also, that food is vital, and so because of that, we're asking you to please donate. Okay, from your abundance. Okay, any food that you can give to the Sandalwood Food Pantry. These people really need, people really need to eat, and thank you all very much. We've been doing this for quite a few years. Now also, in your abundance, okay, I'm sure you have extra money to give, okay, to maintain this property and maintain the people that we have to pay to run this and to carry on and keep this so well. And also the fact that we are in a struggle always, okay, to be better and to do better. And that takes time and that takes money. So we're going to pass the hat for those of you who are first-time visitors. I remember this. If you're a first-time visitor, okay, please you don't have to give, since your presence is a joy to us. So if you'll excuse me, I'm going to get the hat. Thank you so much, and thank you for your generosity. I now turn the program over to Ray Tyler.
Thank you, Irene. And thank you, everyone, for inviting me back. I had a great time last September when I was here, and my wife has realized, she told me this morning at breakfast that her sister Julie told her, Ray needs a classroom. Or I think maybe Linda told Julie that, and she's a little tired of being the sole classroom. So you get to be my classroom today. But I'm very grateful that I was invited to Ann and Dave and everybody who's helped make it happen, and Charlie and my cousin Ann, and of course grateful that Linda came with me today. So thank you, everyone. As Charlie mentioned, I work part-time for an organization called Teaching American History. I've been involved with them one way or another for about 12 years now. And one of the projects I've been working on recently has required me to spend a lot of time with Frederick Douglass. I say required because being asked to spend time with Frederick Douglass is like, for me, making every day my birthday. It's a delight and a joy, and the more I've engaged with him, the more my admiration for the man goes up. Ann has told you the powerful story about how he taught himself to read, a very compelling story. He escaped slavery successfully in 1838, and he had tried once before and failed. 1841, he attends a meeting of the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society where he meets William Lloyd Garrison. You might know that name, is a famous abolitionist, publisher of the Liberator. And in this meeting, he's called upon to tell his stories. He mentions he's an ex-slave, and he's asked to tell his story. He does. He has a powerful baritone, apparently. He's very eloquent. He's very persuasive. The story is compelling. And at that time on, he gets on the lecture circuit, which was for abolitionist movements at that point. And he ends up in 1847 publishing this book, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. Some of you may have been assigned this in high school or college and read this. It's short. If you want to know more about Douglass, here's David Blythe's volume, and when you're done, it doubles as a doorstop. But he writes what's often just called the narrative. And it's interesting why he has to write this. As he goes around this lecture circuit, white people are saying his story must be a hoax. No Negro, much less a Negro slave, could be this intelligent, this articulate, this eloquent, this persuasive. So he writes to give enough details to verify a story. And what does that do? It puts a target on his back as a fugitive slave. He eventually goes to Europe, and he has friends who purchase his freedom. Now, when I started this project for TAH, I was familiar with several of the documents that they asked me to work on. One was What to the Slave is the 4th of July, probably one of his best-known speeches, where he tells the audience that to you, the 4th of July is like Passover. To me, it's a day I mourn. His views begin to change from 1852 as he goes through his life, and that's one thing that David Blythe says in this great big volume about Douglass. He's continually remaking and reinventing himself, yet sticking to his fundamental principle of racial justice, racial equality. He also worked on the speech on the Dred Scott decision that he made, which, if you don't know the Dred Scott decision, is probably one of the worst decisions the Supreme Court has ever made. I would call it the worst. Roger B. Taney, the Chief Justice, says in the opinion, to paraphrase, blacks could not be citizens. They were never expected to be citizens. They were never meant to be citizens, and therefore they had no rights which a white man need respect. There were two other speeches that I was not familiar with that they asked me to work on. One was Self-Made Man, and the other one is the one I want to focus on today, Our Composite Nation. As Ann said when she and I were talking, there are college courses on Frederick Douglass, obviously. We could take a long time. So I'm going to try to narrow it down to Our Composite Nation. I'm going to try to narrow it down to even part of that, not the whole thing. And the reason that this spoke to me, and I thought it was worth taking further and thinking more deeply about it, is not only what Douglass had to say in the speech, which I think is very powerful, but when he said it, which is one of the stages in his life, I think, where it is fair to say, I'm playing sort of amateur psychologist here with the emphasis on amateur, it's probably a time where he's making one of these reinventions or remaking of himself. He begins delivering this speech in 1869, so 4 years after emancipation, 4 years after the end of the Civil War. Now here's my true confession. Why do I think the time this speaks to me? Well, I retired a year ago, and so I'm entering a new chapter in my life, and I'm still adjusting, frankly. You know, I have days where I really enjoy it, and days where I want to see if Walmart's hiring. I'm still working to balance the freedom I want so that Lynn and I could jump in the car, for example, and ride up to Blowing Rock, which is only a couple hours for us, and spend the day. or take on grandchildren if my son and my daughter-in-laws need some help. But I also want to continue using my mind. And my passion has always been American history, so I want to continue to do that. So I'm trying to balance this. So I think seeing Douglass at this point in his life, where I perceive that he's attempting to kind of rebalance his life, I think really spoke to me. Think about what has happened in his life in the recent past, in 1869. He successfully escaped slavery until 1865 and the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which prohibits slavery in the United States forever and a day, with the exception of incarceration, which might be a nice topic for the talkback if you decide to stay there. It opens up a lot of problems. But Douglass, from that time period, 27 years, is hyper-focused on one cause: the abolition of slavery in the United States. From 1863 to 1869, just 6 years, he's seen the Emancipation Proclamation signed and take effect on January 1, 1863, the end of the Civil War, the end of slavery, the 13th Amendment, and the 14th Amendment granting blacks citizenship, which overturns Dred Scott. Now, it might be useful, since the MLK weekend occurred last weekend, to kind of compare King and Douglass where they were. I think King is at the time of his death in 1968 was in a new chapter of his life. Both had overcome adversity, of course. Both had been subject to death threats. Both had been hunted and haunted by federal officials. Both had helped bring about significant change. Douglass, not only with emancipation, but with the enlistment of African American troops in the Civil War, which Lincoln credits him in part with turning the tide of the war. King with the Civil Rights Act of 64 and the Voting Rights Act of 65. Both are facing new challenges. What is the next? What's next in the cause for racial justice? Both address the central question of their time, I think. And here's how Douglass put it in our Composite Nation. When I really love the way he phrased it, it's so clear. Quote, whether we, the United States, are the better or the worse for being composed of different races of men. Whether we, the United States, are the better or the worse for being composed by different races of men. Douglass, in the speech, Our Composite Nation, he attacks this question in two ways. He addresses the reality of life in America in 1869 and the morality of life. He still thinks that America can be that shining city upon a hill. It beacons the rest of the world to come to our shores. Douglass, by this time, believes in that, one of the changes he made over the 20 years. And he goes on to say, quote, we are a country of all extremes. Our people defy all the ethnological and logical classifications. In races, we range all the way from black to white, with intermediate shades which no man can name or number. He goes on to say, in creeds and faiths, the same is true. So we're a racially diverse, ethnically diverse, religiously diverse society already in 1869, which I'm sure you know. He said, what's going to happen? We stand between the populous shores of two great nations, of two great oceans, I should say. All moral, social, and geographical causes conspire to bring us the peoples of all other overpopulated countries. And he says the only principle that's going, so up to this time we've been governed by race pride, not wisdom. And the only principle that's going to allow us to be governed effectively in this composite nation, composite being made up of a lot of different people. This is kind of the melting pot, salad bowl kind of analogy of America. So the only principle that will work is the principle of absolute equality, with the government founded upon justice and recognizing the equal rights of men. I think you could take this speech and with minor revisions, American politicians today could make this same speech. So thus far in the speech, it's kind of what I expected from Douglass. He said we're governed by race pride. He used that term before. Government had kind of put its thumb on the scale in favor of the white man. We know that. It focuses on justice for African Americans. Here's where it gets interesting, the message, I think. He shifts the focus from the relations of the two races, that's a quote, toward a new race making its appearance. At this time, large numbers of Chinese immigrants are beginning to enter the United States. They've already been here to work on the Transcontinental Railroad, which is finished in 1869, the same year Douglass gives his speech. And they're being affected by the same kind of bigotry and anti-immigrant feeling that you saw the Irish and the Germans, now the Chinese, later the Italians, Jewish, Slavic, now Central America. There's nothing new about that. Unfortunately, it goes on. He says they're going to spread across the country. They're not going to just stay in California. If you think you're going to not deal with immigration from Asian peoples in the future because you don't live on the West Coast, you're wrong. And he says, to those people who challenge whether or not this is a good thing or bad thing, his response is powerful. He said, and I'm quoting here, he said, "Do you ask if I would favor such immigration? I would. Would you admit them as witnesses to our courts? I would. Would you have them naturalized and invested with all the rights of American citizenship? I would. Would you allow them to vote? I would. Would you allow them to hold office? I would." Now, to my knowledge, I'm certainly not the Douglass expert. David Blight trumps me on that by a long way. But to my knowledge, this is the first time that Douglass has talked about expanding the idea of racial equality to explicitly include races other than black and white. And he sees a different cause. The principle's the same, racial equity, racial justice, but the problem is a little different after emancipation. He says, "I want a home not only for the Negro, the mulatto, and the Latin races, but I want the Asiatic to find a home here, to feel at home here, for both his sake and for ours." Now, there's several takeaways, I think, that I could talk about based on this connection I feel, the way he speaks to me about finding a new center, finding a new chapter, what's next. Number one, he knew himself. Douglass really knew himself. He knew what his skills, his talents, his aptitudes, and his abilities were, and he wanted to build on that. He wanted to build upon what he had already accomplished. He already became a leader for racial justice. He just wants to kind of expand the continuum a little bit. He's willing to play the long game. He knew that the victory over slavery was just one battle in a war. That meant one thing. It was one thing to defeat slavery. It was another thing to defeat prejudice and racism in the hearts and minds of men and women. And he was willing to change. Early in his career, when he met Garrison, Garrison thought the Constitution was pro-slavery, and Douglass adopted that view. Later on in his career, he came to adopt the view of a man named Gerrit Smith, who thought the Constitution was very anti-slavery, which is a perception a lot of people don't have today. That'd be another good thing to talk about in the talk back. Now, recently I saw a clip on a TV show about a man who his wife had passed away. He was in great despair. He'd go to the park every day. He struck up a friendship with a woman who was also at the park every day. And at one point, she turns to him and said, "You know, society prospers when old men plant trees, even though they know they will never sit under the shade." I think Frederick Douglass always planted trees, all the way up until his death in 1895. For him, he did not have his life cut short like Martin Luther King did. So my advice to myself, and perhaps to you, go and plant a tree. Thank you.
would please now take your hymnals back into your hands and turn with me, if you will, to hymn number 16. Just heard that song being played. Maybe stand together and sing "'Tis a Gift to Be Simple." And visitors here, you may not know that we have a thing that we call a talk back. We take about an hour to reflect on some of the words and some of the points that have been made by our speaker. We gather in this area over here, and I'd love for you to stay if you're a guest, if you feel like you can give us the time. One of the reasons why it's important to me is that I believe the best way for you to discover who we are as a congregation is actually in that talk back. Ray will be bringing some of his messages and expounding on some of the themes. You can hear his passion in his voice and his command of the subject. And I know that you will probably want to be a part of that talkback, so please stay if you would, please. And even as we're beginning to bring our thoughts to a close, and as we're talking about the Asian among us, we're reminded of the awful shooting in California in the Asian community, and I draw our attention to that in sadness and grief and sorrow. We do not yet know what the motive is, at least as far as my understanding, and yet it does not bode well for the Oriental community in California at this time. So I wanted to ask you to stay if you would, please. And Ray, thank you so much for your message. Those of you who have been a part of making this service take place, I thank you for it. John, for your music. David, as you've been all over the building trying to make sure we continue to function. And as well the good news that we have here. So Ray, if you would please, your final remarks.
My father, who was Charles Cotton, and that's cousin Charles Cotton, I'm Charles Ray. Tylers are not known for imaginative names for their sons, but the beloved Uncle Charles to Charlie and Ann, he was a lover of poetry, and he particularly liked T.S. Eliot. So I'm reading from a poem by T.S. Eliot called Little Giddy. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. Through the unknown remembered gate, when the last of earth left to discover is that which was the beginning. At the source of the longest river, the voice of the hidden waterfall and the children in the apple tree, not known because not looked for, but heard, half heard, and the stillness between two waves of the sea. Thank you, and I hope you'll stay for the talk back. That's really the fun part.
Will you please join me in extinguishing the power? The words are in your order of service. Thank you. While we extinguish this flame, we still carry in our hearts the light of truth, the warmth of community, and the fire of commitment, until we are together again.
Douglass.